So, as Adrian said, I'm here to talk about some work that we did for Ocean Outdoor. And it was done in the context that we'd done a study for them a couple of years ago, looking at the impact of big, high-profile premium sites. And it was done very much as something to be complementary to the route work and to be trying to quantify and give another angle on the impact of really big, sort of high-motion sites. That work, as Adrian said, we presented. I think Ocean have done a lot of work putting forward, and they wanted to do a follow-up piece to try and bring this forward into specifically the digital arena, and particularly full motion digital. So that's the sort of context in which we started doing the work for them. And it was being very conscious of all the things we talked about this morning that you'll always be very aware of how quickly this industry is changing, and the fact that there is a need to go beyond just the pure numbers in terms of numbers of views and things like that, to try and get some sort of idea of the impact of these the new digital landscape. So that's where Neuro-Insight came in. Ocean asked us to have a look particularly at digital out of home. And we wanted to do that in a context because it's all very well looking at the impact of these big screens, but we were trying to benchmark digital out of home and say, how does it compare with other media out there? And the obvious thing to benchmark against was television. We've done lots of work in television. Obviously, lots of other people have done lots of work in television. And we know that it's got certain characteristics. It's obviously full motion, it's colour, and so on. But very importantly, television acts as a very strong priming medium for other media. So we've done work that shows that if people see a message on television and then they see a linked message in another secondary medium, their response to that linked message is nearly always heightened. Television is actually priming them to respond more strongly to something that they see subsequently. And so our starting point was Ocean really was saying, well, I wonder whether full motion digital could play a similar role. And it's sort of quite important. We're talking about big numbers here. So the study we did on television that kicked all this off was something we did for ThinkBox, who you'll all be familiar with. And what it showed was that if people had been exposed to an advertisement on television and subsequently went online and saw something in a link campaign, their response to that link campaign was on average about 36% higher. We're talking about brain response, and we're talking about what's going into memory, which I'll talk about a bit more later on. But it's a really key measure. It's linked to the effectiveness of that piece of communication. So we had that information from television, and there have been lots of other studies that have looked at similar things. And so we wanted to set that up as a benchmark and say, could digital out of home play a similar role? And so that was really our starting point for this study. But it wasn't really the starting point because we were actually building on the work we'd done previously that Adrian mentioned. And some of you may have seen that, but for those who haven't, I'll just do a quick sort of summary because that work set out to look at effectively the impact of big, high-profile premium sites. And we were looking at it by measuring people's brain response. We took them on journeys to see the sites, and then we played them a film of the journey they'd undertaken and looked at the brain response second by second as they passed and engaged with different sorts of sites. We looked at a number of measures. We looked at something we call engagement. We mean sense of personal relevance. We looked at what the emotional impact of those sites, and we looked at what was going into memory as people were exposed to them. And we did that for a range of sites, going from really big high-profile things like the IMAX down to much more standard, sort of classic, sort of traditional roadside 48 sheets. And what we found in that study was quite interesting, and Fiona was kind enough to allude to it, that the first thing we found was we looked at the emotional response to those sites. We call the measure emotional intensity. It's the strength of emotional response associated with exposure to a piece of communication. And what you could see, there was quite a clear hierarchy going from sort of non-ocean sites that were just standard sort of classic sites, going through to all ocean, to other premium sites not from ocean, and some of those were really quite good high-profile sites. And then all ocean, and then what we call the ocean unique sites, which were the two towers going out on the A4, it's the IMAX and Holland Park Roundabout. And those sites were seen as being really sort of high profile, and you can see in terms of the emotional response much, much higher than the more standard sites. And we call this the wow factor. Something big, seen on the horizon, dominating your skyline. It just has a big, strong emotional impact on you. So that's what we saw from the previous study. And very importantly, that translated through to memory response. And memory encoding is a really key measure for us. What we're measuring here is not what's already in people's heads, not what's already in memory, but what they're actually sending down or encoding into memory as they're exposed to a piece of communication. Our brains are very selective in what goes into memory, and what tends to go in is stuff that the brain subconsciously says, that's useful, I might need that bit of information later on. So if our brain subconsciously thinks something is useful and interesting, that information gets sent down into memory. And the reason that's important is what our brains do is put into memory information we may want to act on. And for that reason, there's a correlation between memory encoding and subsequent purchase decisions and purchase behavior. So it's not cause and effect. We don't remember something and then go out and buy it. It's sort of the other way around. If our brains subconsciously say, that's useful, that's interesting, I might want to act on that one day, that information gets sent down into memory. So memory is a really key measure for us, and it demonstrated very clearly in this earlier study that not only did these sites have a really strong emotional impact, but they actually were responsible for getting more information down into memory, and increasing the likelihood that people actually would act as a result of seeing the messages on those sites. We also knew from that earlier study that the really high-profile sites could have an impact on priming other more standard sites. So again, one of the things we looked at was the order in which people were exposed to different out-of-home sites. And what we found was if people had seen a message on one of the high-profile sites, one of the really premium ones, and then subsequently saw a link campaign on a more standard site, their response to that link campaign was higher. So there was a priming effect within out-of-home, where the more premium sites were priming people to respond more strongly to the more standard sites. And again, it's something Sean was talking about, combination. The combination of things working together is really important. And again, it's to do with how our brains work. Our brains are looking for patterns. It's how we make sense of the world around us. And if we see something that evokes something we've seen before, part of the brain lights up and says, there's a pattern going on here. This might be important. I'm going to put that information away. So it reflects the way the brain works. But there was this clear priming impact from that earlier study. We also did a bit of subsequent work, which showed, and this won't surprise anyone in the room here, but that full motion digital sites have a stronger impact than static ones. I don't think that's the most world-shattering bit of evidence we've ever come across, but it was a really important part of the mixture, and we've got the information for that as well. So we knew from the previous study that big, high-profile sites have a very strong impact, and we know that full motion sites increase the power of that impact. So we went into this study, into this new bit of research, and we went in with a specific hypothesis, which was that digital out-of-home's ability to prime, to actually increase receptiveness to messages on other media, went beyond out-of-home and actually could extend into the wider media landscape. So that was our sort of hypothesis going into this study. And what we did was measure brain response. So you can see here, fitting headsets to people. We've got those little sensors here. They're actually felt, dipped in saline, salt water, because it's a very good conductor for electrical signals. And we're picking up signals from different parts of the scalp. Because our brains are very specialized, if we can identify what part of our brain is active at a given point in time, we can identify what sort of cognitive process is going on. As we always say to our respondents, we can't read minds. That's not what we're about. But we're interested if the parts of the brain responsible for emotions and responsible for putting things into memory are active as we're watching or exposed to a piece of communication. So we were fitting the headsets. The reason people are wearing the visor is it's part of the methodology we use. We actually create a slight flickering light in the periphery of the vision, which the brain responds to in a particular way. They can see through it. It's not stopping them actually seeing anything, but it creates a sort of rhythmic activity in the brain that we can track. And essentially it means it creates a very, very robust signal that we can report on. So that's what people look like in the study. And we were interested specifically this study in memory encoding because this was all about priming. And if you're going to have a priming impact, stuff needs to go into memory. If it's not in your memory, you can't respond to it differently when you see something subsequently. So we're very interested in memory, and that's the key sort of metric that I'm going to be talking about in this study. But the other really interesting thing about this study is that Ocean were being very brave because they didn't measure response to outdoor in this study. What they were measuring was response to secondary media, to look at these priming effects. So I'll describe in a little bit more detail the methodology in a second, but essentially people were being exposed to big full-motion digital out-of-home sites, and we weren't measuring brain response to that. We then brought them into a study room and measured brain response to other messages from the same campaign, and we were looking to see whether that prior exposure had an impact. I think it's the first time we've ever done that for a media owner, where we've actually done a study that hasn't measured response to their own medium. But it was all to do with this hypothesis going in that there was a priming effect on other media, and that's what we were particularly interested in. Are you with me so far? It's going to get a bit technical, and then I'm going to get onto the results. So hopefully not too technical. It was a really big sample. So 192 people. I think at that stage, it was the biggest sample we'd used in a study in the UK. And that's big enough to give us very robust quantified data. And indeed, it was a big enough sample to split. So we were able to actually do what I said right at the start, to set up television as a control. So we were interested in the priming effect of digital out of home, but we wanted to compare it to something. And we wanted to compare it to television. Because actually coming into this study, our starting point was, if we can do the same job as television, actually that's a pretty good place to be. So part of the sample were exposed to digital out of home, and part of them were exposed to television. We split the sample, so everyone saw one of those priming media, nobody saw both. So we'd be able to compare responses depending on what people had been primed by. And to add another layer to it, to actually help us understand the results, we used two different campaigns. Got our old friend Lynx again, different campaign, same brand, and we had Peugeot. And so everyone in the study, there were actually 4 cells in the study. There were people who were exposed to Lynx on a digital out-of-home site, and there were people who were exposed to Peugeot on one of those sites. And similarly, there were people who were exposed to Lynx on TV, and people who were exposed to Peugeot on TV. Nobody was in more than one of those cells. So there were 4 distinct cells in the study. Remember, this was all prior to brain imaging. So this was the prior exposure before we actually got people into a room and started to measure brain response. So this was simply to expose them and to see what impact that exposure had on their subsequent brain response. For the ocean sites, we actually split the field work, and we had 2 different sites. We had Eat Street and New Street in Birmingham. I didn't realise there were full sound as well as full digital here. But what's quite important, so what we did in the study was actually we convened our respondents. We pre-recruit them like you would do for a focus group. We convened them at an outside location, and we said, sorry, the location's moved, we just need to walk 100 yards down the road to the study location. And they walked past one of these sites. We didn't draw their attention to the site. We didn't say, oh, look, there's an ocean site up there. Isn't that a Lynx poster? It would have made our life much easier, but we didn't. We resisted the temptation. One of the characteristics of ocean sites, a lot of them, is they've got quite long eye lines. So absolutely, people had the chance to see this, but we weren't asking them to look. And similarly, those ads that we were interested in didn't appear soulless on those sites. They were part of a normal loop, as people would see them in the normal situation. So we weren't trying to do anything other than the normal viewing situation. Those respondents being exposed to digital out of home, we met at a distance from the site, from the study location. They walked past the sites, no attention drawn to them, taken into the study location. So that was the priming, and that was all they got. That was the only priming they had. For the TV groups, we wanted to do something similar. So in that case, we asked people to arrive a few minutes early. We put them in a side room and said, sorry, we're not quite ready for you yet. There was a TV in there. He said you can just watch TV if you want. It was actually an episode of House of Cards. So we wanted something that was a good program people would want to watch. And in that, there was an ad break. And that ad break, for some groups, had a Peugeot ad, and for some had a Lynx ad. So people were exposed to one of the 2. Again, we didn't ask them to watch television. We didn't draw their attention to it. In fact, I would say this probably biased the study in favour of television a bit, because if you're sitting in the room with nothing else to do, you will sit and watch the television. Whereas walking down the road, you could be chatting to your mate or whatever. But again, we didn't tell people exactly what was going on. We just showed them TV. The TV was on in the room as they were waiting to come in. So people were exposed to one of those 4 things. And still prior to taking brain response. They then came into our study room. We fitted the headsets. And we then showed them a number of pieces of communication featuring ads from both Lynx and Peugeot. So at this stage, everyone saw everything. So they'd been primed by one thing, but they now saw everything. So the first thing they saw was a couple of magazines. So it's an edition of Wired with a Lynx ad in it. It's quite near the front, so people had a good chance of seeing it. and an issue of the week with a Peugeot ad in. Again, we didn't draw people's attention specific to the ads, we just asked them to browse the magazines. We actually filmed them while they were doing that, individually, so each person, we could see the exact point in time where they turned over and were exposed to the ad. And we were able to link that filmed behaviour to their individual brain response. So we knew the specific moment when people were looking at one of the ads, and we could identify what was happening in their brains at that specific moment in time. And we did a similar thing with some online stuff. They were actually exposed to some online messages using iPads. So they were all given iPads. There were some bookmarks on there. They were asked to do a bit of general internet browsing, and then we sent them to a couple of websites. The two websites which had ads in. I think there was it was a CNN news site, and I can't remember the other one, something like Digital Spy. And each of those had, one had an ad for links, one had an ad for Peugeot. And the final thing we did was to send them to the websites for those two brands. So that was the very final thing, because that was obviously a little bit more obvious what we were looking at that point. And during this time, we were taking brain response to all of that, but the specific moments where they were exposed to the brand advertising that had been linked to one of the campaigns they'd seen earlier. So everyone saw one campaign coming into the study. Once in the study, they saw both campaigns. And what that allowed us to do was to make a number of different comparisons. So this is just browsing through. As I say, they weren't particularly drawn to the ads, but they were likely to see them. Here we go. This is showing the activity on the iPads. You can see the ads weren't enormously prominent. They were just there as to normal display ads. We didn't sort of overdo it. So what that study methodology, and I apologise for taking a long time to explain it, but if I didn't set that up, when I get to the results, which are much quicker to explain, they wouldn't make a lot of sense. So this allows us to compare two or three things. We were able to look at responses to the magazine and mobile online ads amongst those who'd previously been exposed to a linked campaign. And we could compare that with people who'd been exposed to the campaign on digital out of home with those who've been exposed on television. So it's direct comparison. Two matched groups, one saw an ad on television, one saw one on digital out of home. And in both cases, we could look at responses to unlinked advertising. So we could look at the people who'd seen links and see how they responded to Peugeot and vice versa. And we could look at responses to ads from the same campaign. So people who'd seen links and then saw links, people who'd seen Peugeot then saw Peugeot. So we were able to compare those things. And again, it was set up as a direct comparison. It was absolutely matched samples. So it was very robust in terms of making sure that what we were comparing was sort of fair and honest. So the results, and I must say the results took us by surprise, because we were expecting, as I say, we were hoping that what we'd find was a headline that said, full motion digital out of home can play the same sort of role as television. And that would have been a great win. That's a really nice sort of statement for the industry to make. But that wasn't exactly what we found. What we found was a little bit more subtle than that. So the first thing was that the medium itself that people were exposed to could have a priming effect, regardless of the creative. So simply by being exposed to out of home or being exposed to television impacted the way that people responded to what they saw next, regardless of the creative. So it's the medium itself, and it was a very strong effect. It was very statistically significant. And what we found was that when we looked at magazines, if you take as a base the people who'd been primed by digital out of home, indexed at 100, the people who'd been primed by television, their responses were 11% higher, which is statistically significant. It's not the hugest number you're going to see, but it is significant. So what that's saying is the very act of watching television is making people a bit more receptive to magazines. And probably more interesting to you, most of you in the room, is that if we look at the other way around, people who'd been primed by television being indexed at 100, if we then look at the response of those instead who've been primed by digital out of home, just for an unmatched campaign was 36% higher, which is a big, big number. And this was regardless of creative. This was simply as a result of seeing one of the media or another. And this was quite a very unexpected finding. And I remember talking to the neuroscientists in Australia who do our analysis, and they're all academics based over there, and saying, well, what's behind this? Have we seen something like this before? I remember talking to Tim Bleakley at Ocean about it, who said in rather more robust terms, well, how on earth could that happen? Except he didn't say on earth. But there is a reason for it, and it's very consistent with other things we've seen about the brain, and we call it a congruence effect. I'm sure you all know what congruence means, but somebody's kindly put your definition there just in case. And what we mean by the congruence effect when we're looking at neuroscience is that our brains all the time are in particular states. We can be very emotionally engaged by something. We can be very rationally engaged by something. It can be a more left or right brain response. And when we're in a particular brain state, we see a message which is consistent with that brain state, we're more receptive to it. It's something we've seen in television a lot. We've presented papers to the Advertising Research Foundation in New York showing how that in television advertising, if you place an ad in a program where they both have a left brain predominance, or indeed a right brain predominance, rather than competing with each other, the average levels of memory encoding go up about 25%. So there's a very, very strong effect for matching media. And we're seeing something very similar here. And so we call it the congruence effect. And what we're seeing in this case is that when people were watching television is a sit-back, relaxed, quite an immersive experience, a bit like reading a magazine. That in terms of your brain state, they actually elicit a very similar type of brain response. Whereas if you look at digital out of home and online, they're both about enhanced response to communication on the go. You get that when you're digital out of home, and you get it when you're using an iPad, so sitting somewhere outside your normal environment. And so in both those cases, our brains are in a more receptive state. So regardless of the creative, having been exposed to one medium, we are more receptive to a medium that elicits a similar sort of brain state. So it was a very strong effect, which we hadn't been expecting, but was very soundly statistically significant. It did raise the immediate question, which was, well, how could we be certain it is the out-of-home that's doing it? It's not just the experience of walking down the street versus sitting in a room. And the answer to that is that when you do match the creative, that priming effect is amplified quite significantly. And that's what you'd expect. But it's showing this isn't just something random to do with walking down the street. It is linked to what people saw. So if we look at that, building on the graph I showed you just now, this is magazines. So we had the 11% increase for people who'd been exposed to television for an unmatched campaign, going up to 26% higher when it was a matched campaign. So, when people had been exposed to that match campaign, basically television was priming them for magazines 27% higher than digital out of home was. If we turn that the other way around and look at what's happening with digital out of home, that number goes up to nearly half as strong again, 48% higher response when people had been primed to digital out of home, when they subsequently saw matched messaging on an iPad, on a sort of mobile device. So, really strong effect. There's no way in the world this happens randomly. It was shown very clearly that what you're getting is a priming effect that is to do with the way that those media are congruent with one another. They're eliciting similar brain states. And so, pulling all this together, what have we sort of learned across the two studies, really, in terms of what's happening with the brain? I think there's some really quite significant things, and I think in the way that the industry is moving forward at the moment, lots and lots of food for thought. And listening to the speakers this morning, it certainly was sparking things up in my mind about how what we've done is tying up with the things that they've been talking about as well. So the first thing is that going back to the original study, that's an ICONI. I think we've lost a C somewhere there. But large, iconic format advertising delivers a strong emotional response. It's what Fiona said in her speech, that there's a wow factor. We see something big on the skyline. There's quite a primitive response in our brain that just goes, whew, something big's going on. I'm going to take notice of that. And that's carried through into the emotional response, into the memory response that's associated with that. We've also found out, and I don't think a great surprise, but very important, we have the evidence for it, that if you have a full motion screen, that response is that much stronger. So big iconic sites elicit very strong emotional response, even greater when that goes through to full motion, and that carries through to memory encoding as well. Remember, memory encoding is what links to purchase behavior, so really key. We also knew from that first study that those big iconic sites could have an impact on priming other out-of-home sites. And this study wanted to take that one step further by saying, can that carry beyond out of home into the wider digital landscape? And the answer was, yes, absolutely it can. And in fact, it's not, even if you take out the creative out of the equation, the medium itself can have a priming effect. There is a congruence, there is a synchronicity between these two media, digital out-of-home screens and digital on the go, that means they reinforce the effectiveness of one another. And specifically that digital out-of-home primes mobile devices. And unsurprisingly, that effect is all the stronger when you've actually got linked creative. So you've got a sort of chain of findings there, I guess, which all relate to the way these things work together. And I think start to give some really interesting food for thought about how this starts to work in the new landscape that we're entering into. That it's really nice evidence about the things that were spoken about earlier this morning, that there really is a link between what's going on these big screens and what's going on the little screens, and that digital out of home has a stronger, more positive, more powerful role to play in that respect than some of the traditional media, which still remain incredibly powerful and important. But if you're wanting to have a campaign which people are going to be exposed to on mobile devices, it will be enhanced by exposure to digital out of home as well. Those two things will work really strongly together. And that's it, which gives 4 minutes and 20 seconds if you've got any questions.